Good. Okay, let's start on time because I'm sure your time is valuable. So it is 8 o'clock. Whoever, I try to say all the great stuff right at the very beginning. So if you're late, you miss everything. So you can brag about it later when people come late. Okay, so welcome to the Sobol Says Wednesday night edition, the first ever one. Let's see how this goes. I do get a little cranky at night, so I'm not sure how this will fare compared to my morning class, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, so this week is Parshas Vayigash. I'm just getting to know my shtender here, so bear with me. As a general rule, as long as I remember my glasses, we will probably do Rashi. Otherwise, it doesn't happen anymore for me, so I have come to accept that reality. Okay, this week's Parsha is Parshas Vayigash. It's on page 250. It basically begins in the middle of a story. As we ended off last week, Yehuda had approached Yosef. You can sense the power of these two men as Yehuda approaches him, and there's a sense everybody shrinks away, and Yehuda comes now to make something between a desperate plea and a threatening warning that Yosef should free them, or at most really just enslave them, but all of them. That's how it works. So Yehuda assumes the mantle of leadership by approaching Yosef at this point, pleading on behalf of Binyamin and ultimately Yaakov, and he culminates with his offer to accept him as a slave in lieu of Binyamin. Of course, at this point, he has chipped away at Yosef's heart to the point that Yosef can no longer restrain himself, and at this point, Yosef declares very simply in what is perhaps the most emotional statement in all Chamishei Chumshei Torah, he simply says, I am Yosef, Od Avichai, is my father alive. That's it. That simple statement, everything stops after that, everybody breaks down after that, and it was it. No rebuke of any kind, no insinuations. As a matter of fact, Chazal tell us that this actually was the greatest form of rebuke. He need not say anything else. All he had to do is simply declare who he was. And it says it's compared to the times of Mashiach, when it says that Hashem will remove the sheath of the sun, which is understood to mean allegorically that no explanation will be needed for anything that has happened throughout history. We will have crystal clear understanding. It'll be like, I totally understand now. Everything makes perfect sense to me. All the things that were puzzling me, all the things I thought unfair, ultimately, everything is easy to understand, no questions at all. And this is in line with, in general, the idea of Hashgacha Pratis, which, and we discussed that in many parshas, the idea in the story of Yosef as well as all of our lives, that this is all part of God's master plan. It's hard for us to see it. You can imagine if you look in, if you go to a museum and you watch the people that really know what they're doing, or at least it appears like they know what they're doing, I'm not sure. They never stand right up next to the picture. They always stand in the middle of the room. That's the best viewing. Why? Because in order to appreciate the picture, you need to see it from a distance. When you're up close, all you're seeing are like paint marks, and you see the canvas. It makes no sense to you. It's a jumble. But when you're able to step back and see it from far away, you have perfect clarity. And that is really what life is as well. Of course, we don't understand many of the things because we have an up-close view. We're in it. We can't understand it. But ultimately, when we step back, and sometimes we don't even get the ability to see how it worked out well for us. Sometimes we're lucky too, sometimes not. But ultimately, if we could step back, we would understand that every single thing had an exact purpose for us to reach where we needed to be. And it seems, and I'm sure we can each think of moments in our life, or many moments in our lives, where we thought something was horrible, only to finally understand that it was for our best. We know Rabbi Akiva. There's, of course, a very famous story with Rabbi Akiva, where with his rooster, his candle, and his donkey, where he goes, the Gemara tells us, he goes into the forest, and the donkey gets stolen, the candle goes out, the rooster is stolen as well. So most people think that Rabbi Akiva was famous for saying Gamzu Latova, that this too is for the good. But in fact, that's not Rabbi Akiva's mantra. Rabbi Akiva's statement in the Gemara, and one of his essences, is Kol da'avid Rachmana Latava Avid. Everything that the Creator does, he does for the good. Now the reason why people confuse that with Gamzu Latova is a very little known fact, that Nachum Ish Gamzu, who is famous for the Gamzu Latova, is Rabbi Akiva's Rebbe. The reason why people don't realize that is it only says it once in all of Shas. He was his Rebbe before Rabbi Eliezer was his Rebbe, and ultimately Rabbi Yoshua as well. Nachum Ish Gamzu was famous for saying Gamzu Latova. The Gemara as well gives a series of stories that seemed terrible, and he says Gamzu Latova. This too is for the good. Rabbi Akiva says Kol da'avid Rachmana Latava Avid. Whatever God does, he does for the good. The difference is as follows. My dear friend Rabbi Yitzhak Asuli once gave me a great insight to this. When Rabbi Akiva said, everything God does, he does for the best, that's, not even a level that we can reach. What we understand is, I can't necessarily see the good in this, but I know it's for the good, or it's going to lead to the good. Nachum Ish Gamzu said, Gamzu Latova. He could see the good in the very thing, in the very seemingly bad thing. He could see the good in that. He said, Gamzu Latova. This very thing is for the good. Not that it's going to lead to the good, it is good. Rabbi Akiva, his student, already falls down from that level. He already is just Kol da'avid Rachmana Latava Avid. That was the difference between the two. And Rabbi Akiva being lower than somebody is a big deal, but it is Nachum Ish Gamzu. And that was the qualitative difference in the way they saw things. But nonetheless, that's exactly what happened with the brothers, and we're going to touch on that idea a little bit more later on. But that's exactly what happened with the brothers. The moment Yosef reveals himself, the moment he says, Ani Yosef Chai, Ani Yosef, then ultimately, everything became clear. Every fight they had from the time they were young, everything that happened, why they sold him, everything was perfectly clear. At that point, they understood it was all for the good. And we're going to talk about that more later on. But there's one very interesting thing to note, and then we're going to cover the rest of the parsha, and we're going to come back to a couple of themes. When you look at Yehuda's plea to Yosef, the Chidushei HaRim points out something unbelievable. If you look at all of his arguments, everything he points out is always our father. What's going to happen to his father? Benjamin's father, if I don't bring him back, he's going to die. It's constantly focusing on how bad it's going to be for Yaakov. Okay? Sounds reasonable, right? He has an elderly father, have mercy on him. Father, 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 father. It sounds perfectly reasonable until if you skip to page 260, in Pasuk 21, we learn something fascinating. They list all the Shvatim and their children, and you'd be surprised to know, Uvnei Binyamin, Bela, Vecher, Ashbel, Gera, Naaman, Echi, Rosh, Mupim, Chupim, and Ard. Binyamin has 10 sons. He has 10 sons, and the best argument Yehuda can make is that he has an elderly father. What about the 10 sons? That would seem to be, if you want to tug at somebody's heartstring, say, he has 10 kids at home, who's going to support them, who's going to feed them, who's going to raise them? That's the argument. What do you mean he has an elderly father? Why not speak about the sons? So from here we learn, says the Chidushei HaRim, that which people say, he says it's usually said about mothers, but this is his source, and we're talking about fathers, that one father can take care of 10 children, but 10 children cannot take care of one father. And the idea is then, I'm sure we've all experienced that in one way or another, it's amazing. A parent could have a lot of kids, you can take care of all of them, right? When the parent gets older, this kid says, it's your turn to take care, your turn to take care. All of a sudden, nobody can handle just one parent, one person. But if you have a sinking feeling, thinking about the fact that maybe you've been guilty about that as well, you should know the following. The Chedushei HaRim tells us that the reason why is because when Adam HaRishon was created, so he was able, all of our emotions, all of our attitudes are in our DNA from Adam HaRishon. He was able to imbue us with all of these different emotions. But there's one thing he couldn't pass on, and that was love of parents. And that's because, notwithstanding what other religions may say, he is the only person in history who was born without parents. And so he could not pass that one idea along. Now, that's not to say, of course, we love our parents, we love parents naturally, but nonetheless, that extra ability to be able to take care of a parent, Adam HaRishon never experienced that. Therefore, he could not pass that down to us. And so we have a little bit of a weakness in that area. But nonetheless, it's very interesting to see from this that with all the talk of the father, you would have thought he said, what about his sons? But ultimately, we know that Lo Aleinu, we should never experience it, that the love a parent has for a child is much greater than the love a child has for a parent, and the loss would be that much greater. So, then after Yosef discloses who he is, they have a very emotional encounter with the brothers, specifically with his full brother Binyamin, his only full brother. And if you turn to page 254, Pasuk 14, there's something very interesting. It's a very famous pasuk. As they see each other, it says, "Vayipol at Savarei Binyamin achiv, vayevk uVinyamin bacha al Savarav." So he then fell upon his brother Binyamin's neck and wept, and Binyamin wept on his neck. So there's a very famous Rashi on this, right? Because it seems like not necessarily the most important detail that they need to tell us that. Of course, we understand it's going to be an emotional reunion. But even so, what is this idea of crying on their necks? So it's a very famous Rashi. Rashi tells us, because I did bring my glasses, so we can do it. Rashi tells us, "Vayipol Savarei Binyamin achi vayef al shnei mikdashos shasidim lios bechelko shel Binyamin v'sofo lehecharev." So, and it's really necks in plural, as I often say in my class, Art Scroll, which is like the greatest thing to ever happen to our generation. Nonetheless, when it comes to their translation, so you have to beware. Their translation is very often infused, or it's coded with whichever commentator they're choosing to go by for that word. Very often it's not going to be a literal translation, but rather it's taking a position on what one of the Mefarshim is saying. So not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's important to understand that may not be a literal translation. And if they're in trouble and they have no answer, they just sweep over it with something. I mean, if you really look closely, it's fun to notice that. In any event, so it says he fell on his brother Binyamin's neck. Rashi points out it's really two things he's crying over. He's crying over the two Batei Mikdashos that are eventually going to be destroyed. Why on Binyamin? Because it was in Binyamin's territory. That's where the Beis HaMikdash was located, and therefore he's crying over that. The next Rashi, Uvinyamin bacha al Tzavarav, and Binyamin cried on Yosef's shoulder, Al Mishkon Shiloh Shasi Lios Bechalko Shel Yosef V'Sofo Lehecharev. And he was crying, Binyamin, on the neck, the single neck of Yosef, because the Mishkan in Shiloh, which predates the Beis HaMikdash, was in the territory of Ephraim, who's the son of Yosef, and was ultimately destroyed as well, and therefore he was crying on Yosef's neck for that very reason. Okay, it's a very beautiful Rashi. The only question we can ask is, why does the neck refer to the Beis HaMikdash or to the Mishkan? Right? This is not an inexact statement, right? This is, okay, it's very nice. You could say a nice little shot here, but Rashi's not just saying, oh, you know, that seems to go nice. Happens to be 2 and 1, that works. The neck is specifically a symbol of the Beis HaMikdash in Shiloh. So we're going to come back to that as well a little later on and look at that. Then comes the very famous Agalot, right, where he sends, I don't think you could go through any class or on this parsha, and there is not at least a mention of the agalot being the wagons that, and the story's a little confusing because it's clear Paro at first says to send wagons, but ultimately they are referred to as Yosef's wagons, so nonetheless, he sells the wagons. We're going to come back to that. Of course, they make a play on word with agalot and egla arufa. We're going to come back to that as well. But then Yosef sends his brothers back to to Yaakov, and then we have another reunion. Okay? There's a little bit of details. Yaakov packs up, goes to Beit El, gives a sacrifice. Then the reunion happens. And once again, we have crying on necks. Only they're different over here. Many commentators speak about this. We turn to page 260, pasuk 29. The bottom of the page. Vayeser Yosef merkavto, vayal likros Yisrael aviv, Goshna, vayer elav, vaypol al tzavarav, vayef al tzavarav, od. So Yosef harnessed his chariot. He went up to meet his father, Yaakov, in Goshen. Yisrael, he's called actually. He appeared before him, fell on his neck, and he wept on his neck excessively. Okay, the word there, od, means excessively. He was crying very strong. Here, Rashi does not tell us that it is a Beis HaMikdash maneuver. Here Rashi has something else to say. He says, Vayef al Savarav Od, means a lot. Lashon Harbos B'chiyah, it's a lot of crying. Kilo al Ish, okay, he proves it. Then he says the following statement, gratuitously. Avkan Harbevos, Aval Yaakov lo nafal at Savarei Yosef lo nishku v'amru Rabosenu shaya korei es shma. Very perplexing Rashi. Here, Rashi could have just stayed with the reason why he's explaining that it was a lot of crying, but then he adds in the following. He says that, in fact, if you look at the pasuk, right, it's very unclear, the pasuk. See, again, ArtScroll glosses over it a little bit. It's not clear who we're talking about. You know, my English teacher would have crushed me on this, right? There's ambiguous references in this pasuk. It's not clear who's doing the crying, right? If you look at the Hebrew part, it says, right, Vayar elav, he saw him. Who saw who? Or he appeared before him. I don't know who the hymns are there. Vayipol atzavarav, somebody falls on somebody's neck, and he wept on his neck excessively. So even if we're going to accept that interpretation, why do we need to know? Fine, so we could be bothered by the fact that it could be from reading this we understand only one person's crying. Right? Because there's only one he. We could probably get away with saying it was both, but fine. Only one of them crying. Now, we could have just assumed the other one was still in shock. Right? I'm not sure who was more in shock at that moment. You know, they both hadn't seen each other. I mean, Yaakov, to him, Yosef probably looked so different at this point, right? Because it wasn't just how long he was away, but the fact that it was in his formative years, right? I mean, he left at 17, so he looks like a completely different person at this point. Could be shocking. But here, instead, Rashi, bringing down the Maimer Chazal, tells us he was saying Shema. That's what he chose to do at that moment. So we're going to come back to that as well because every commentator has something to say about that. Finally, the brothers set up in Goshen. It was a little bit farther away from the Egyptian mainland, we'll call it, so they could stay a little bit separate. Yaakov and Paro meet. Then they go back to the story of the famine, and then the parsha ends. So now we're going to go back to the beginning of the parsha and look at one of the most spoken events in this parsha, as I referenced, to see if we could put our own spin on it and extract an important lesson. So we know that when Yosef sends the brothers back home to Yaakov to tell them the good news, he rightfully suspects, so first he suspects Yaakov is going to be skeptical, and so he thinks that Yaakov is going to be very skeptical, so he wants to send this sign, right? This sign, page 256, pasuk 27. What is the sign? It's he says, "Vayidabru elav es kol divrei Yosef asher diber aleihem, vayares hagalos asher shalach Yosef laseiso so vadchi ruach Yaakov avihem." So interesting. So they related all the words that Yosef said. Okay, what it was he said, There's a big machlokas, and once Yaakov sees the wagons, then his spirit is revived. So it's a very strange pasuk why that would revive his spirit. Now, Rashi tells us the last inyan, the last sugya, the last thing they had been learning was the parsha of Egla Arufa. Egla Arufa, just very briefly, is the idea that when somebody dies, is found on the road, we'll call them a nameless person, the elders of the towns, and it's in between town lines, the elders of the towns measure out whose town it's closer to. The elders of that city then do an entire procession, basically some sort of vidoy, confessing, we did not kill this man, etc. They then take an egel, a calf, and they don't shecht it, they actually hack it from the back of the neck, and that is a kapara of sorts for the event that some blood was shed. The reason why is that they should have escorted this person on the way, and they didn't. He was alone. Somehow they bear culpability for that. That's the idea of the Egla Arufa. So we're going to touch on that in a minute, but what doesn't get a lot of notice with these wagons is something else that Yosef sends along. He sends along, if you go the previous page at the bottom, Ula Aviv, Pasuk 23, Shalach Kizos Asara Chamorim Nosim Mitu Mitzrayim. He sends 10 donkeys. 10 he-donkeys and 10 she-donkeys, together with these agalot. Now the reason why they don't get that much attention, obviously, is because it doesn't say that's what did it for Yaakov, that's what got him excited and that he knew. Now, we know the famous Medrash tells us they had warmed Yaakov up, so to speak, by having Serach bas Asher, Serach, who was the daughter of Asher, play the harp or the lyre or whatever it is, and softly singing that Yosef was still alive. So it was going in his subconscious, Yaakov's subconscious, so that when the brothers actually came and gave him the news, it wasn't such a shock to him. He was prepared for that. That's fine. But it was the agalot that seemed to get him happy. And these donkeys, the Torah tells us that he sent these 10 donkeys. What are they for? So I once heard something from Rabbi Frand on that, which we're going to come to in a minute as well. But imagine what should have been Yaakov's reaction after he gets this news, right? So first, he's ecstatic. His long-lost son has returned. But then, after it digests for a minute, he's going to turn to the brothers. And he's going to lace into them, right? This is exactly what I suspected all this time. And we know Yaakov harbored doubts. He believed one of the reasons he was suspicious, by the way, is because the Medrash tells us that Hashem gives a special blessing for us to be able to forget, for us to be able to have nechama. When somebody is deceased, right? If we didn't have the ability to not forget them, God forbid, in the sense that they're gone from your memory, but to be able to move on for that pain, we'd be stuck in that mode the whole time. So the Medrash tells us that it's a 1-year period, and that is the connection for a parent to the Avelis. That year is the mourning period, is the consolation period. After that, we are able to move on. What happened? A year goes by, and Yaakov is not at all happy. He has not at all moved on. So, we would look at it a different way, right? We'd start going, I got to see my therapist, I got blah, blah, blah. What does Yaakov do? He says, I smell a rat. Something is wrong, because I should be feeling better about this at this point, and I don't. So he had suspicions, but of course, there was nothing he could do. Now comes Yosef. He didn't stumble into Egypt, right? Yaakov understands something must have happened, so we're in the story, right? It should be a moment where Yaakov now turns to the brothers and gives it to him. The only time we ever see him excoriate them is in next week's Parsha, Shimon and Levi, he gives it to, and maybe we'll talk about that next week. But for this week, nothing. And he has not even acknowledged it. So based on that, let's look at one more thing, and then we'll try to tie it all together. As we mentioned before also, when Yaakov and Yosef are finally reunited, Yaakov does not cry, since at the moment he sees Yosef, he starts saying Shema. And he's busy saying Shema, he doesn't cry. And finally, Hashem tells Yaakov, this is our last piece of the puzzle, Hashem tells Yaakov on page 258, Psukim 3 and 4, he says to Yaakov as follows, I am the God of your father, have no fear of descending into Egypt, I'll establish you as a great nation, I'll descend into Egypt with you, and I shall surely bring you up. And then he says, and Yosef shall place his hand on your eyes. Now Yosef placing his hand on his eyes, obviously we understand what that would mean. Eventually he's going to live with Yosef till he passes away. Yosef will close his eyes, he'll live a good long life with his beloved Yosef. But the Zohar tells us on this pasuk that this is the secret of what Kriyat Shema is all about. That's all the Zohar says. This is the secret of what Kriyat Shema is all about. So the Kol Aryeh explains this comment on a Gemara in Psachim that says that in this world we say the bracha of Hatov v'Hametiv when something is good. If something happens good, we say Baruch Hashem Hatov v'Hametiv. If something happens that we consider bad, we say Baruch Dayan Ha'emes, right? In that statement, we're saying this is pretty bad, but Hashem is the judge. He is the true judge. That's what we say. But in the world to come, they don't have such a bracha. No bracha Baruch Dayan Ha'emes exists. It's only Hatov v'Hametiv. And that's because in the world to come, they understand everything is for the good. Even that bad, they understand is for the good. In other words, it's not only that it works out for the best, they understand, like we heard from Nachum Ish Gamzu, that the thing itself is good. So they don't have such a bracha as Baruch Dayan Ha'emes, because Baruch Dayan Ha'emes is really us saying, Kol David Rachmano L'Tava Avid. Whatever God does, he does for the best. Baruch Dayan Ha'emes, yeah, I don't feel that great about this, but I know God is doing it for the best. So based on the above, we can now understand what was going on. So let's turn to page 254 again, Pasuk 17. Because when Paro first says, send these animals, these donkeys, which later become a donkey, he uses an unbelievably unusual term for animals, such that it almost doesn't appear anywhere else. It says, Vayomer Paro Yosef emor elechecha ve'zosasu. This is what you should do. Ta'anu es be'irchem u'lechubo arza Canaan. Ta'anu es be'irchem is translated as load up your animals. Where are we? Load up your animals and go directly. Be'irchem here means animals. A very, very strange terminology. So strange that when you have a word that you need some real explaining, you go to Rav Shamshon Rafal Hirsch, because he very often will take a word and spend pages discussing it. So he says the following about this word be'irchem and why it means animals. I mean, he has pages. I'm going to give you a paragraph. And he is basically discussing all the different names that you use for an animal. And then he says be'ir means animal. Why? Because they are living creatures. However, they are unable, in this term, they are unable to remove themselves from the divine will. In these creatures, every impulse and every action is an involuntary product of the divine fire. Okay, the word be'ir is like be'or chametz, right, when you burn your chametz. So he's connoting that word to fire, the divine fire which has given them life. And the whole dynamic of their lives is nothing but a burning. As long as this force of fire lives in them, they cannot remove themselves from it. Accordingly, be'ir is the most representative term for an animal in respect to its unfree, instinctive nature. So Rav Hirsch is telling us that when the Torah uses that terminology, it's not just telling us it was an animal, it's highlighting a particular aspect of these animals, which is that they have no free will whatsoever. They do exactly as their master tells them. So based on that, now we can understand the significance of why Yosef sends those 10 donkeys and why Yaakov doesn't lose it. Because he was saying the following: 10 donkeys represent his 10 brothers. And he was saying to his father, don't be angry with the 10 brothers. They were just donkeys, so to speak. All they were doing was going along as part of this master plan. I know it seems like they had bad intentions, but it was almost an unfree, instinctive nature of theirs to be doing this. Now, Understand, of course, we bear responsibility for our actions, regardless of whether we feel we were part of the divine plan or not. But he was trying to tell Yaakov, understand the bigger picture. These people did something they didn't know what they were doing. Hashem wanted this to happen. That's why it broke down like this, and that's why he uses that terminology and uses donkeys. And they were not acting on their own. They were being led by their master, their creator, since these were the necessary steps in Egypt to bring us down to Egypt. And that is why Yaakov says Shema as soon as he sees Yosef. Because what are the words of Shema? Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. You should break it down in those three sets. Shema Yisrael, listen Israel. Hashem Elokeinu. Hashem there is spelled Yud Kei Vav Kei, the first one, which means, because it seems repetitive, Hashem our God. No. The first one is Yud Kei Vav Kei, which represents God's attribute of Rachamim, of mercy. Elokeinu represents God's attribute of strict justice. What Shema is telling us is, listen Israel, Hashem Elokeinu, the God of mercy and the God of strict justice, Hashem Echad. It's all one God. It's all for the good. You may see sometimes God acting with his characteristic of strict justice. You may see him sometimes acting with mercy. It's all the same. It's all the same God. And we see that next Hashem name is also Yud Kei Vav Kei. Yud Kei Vav Kei Echad. It is one name and it's all for the good. That is the message of Shema, that we need to understand that. And that's why when Yaakov finally sees Yosef and saw that all the bad for all this time that he had thought was bad, that Yosef was missing, that there was discord in his family, that there was famine where he was, it was all part of the master plan for the good. And that's why he's immediately inspired at that moment to say Shema, because that's a recognition of that very fact. As he sees his son Yosef with all the glory of Egypt coming out to greet him, he understands Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. It's all one God. And as for the Zohar's comment that Yosef placing his hand on the eyes of Yaakov is the secret of Kriyat Shema, so we can suggest the following. That's the source of the custom that we learn from Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. He is the one we learn because in the Gemara it gives a very small snippet of a story that we cover our eyes when we say Shema. It says because Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was Toraso Umanuso, he was learning Torah all the time, so he didn't have to have formal davening, but he would stop in the middle of shir, it says he would cover his eyes, say Shema, and go back to giving shir. From there we know that is our custom for covering our eyes when we say Shema. But we can suggest the following, that while it's a laudatory ideal to see that everything Hashem does for the good, and I could speak for 2 years on that, ultimately it's not so easy to do it. Right? It's really hard to do sometimes. And as we said, even Rabbi Akiva fell a level from his Rebbe, who could mamish see the good in that. He was already just saying, I know it's for the good. And for us to even be able to do that is very hard. And so it could very well be, that's why we have to close our eyes. Because sometimes as we see all the chaos around us, the terrorism, all the terrible things going on in the world, when we say a statement like Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, we just need to cover our eyes. That's what we need to do sometimes. Just ignore what's around you. Know that it's so. That's what you have to do. That is the secret of the Kriyat Shema. Because ultimately, you need to understand it's all one God. It's all for the good, regardless of what we see. Which brings us to our final thoughts. I have not checked my... okay, we're doing okay, actually. Which brings us to our final thought. So I mentioned at the beginning that we have the very curious incident when Yosef and Benjamin see each other for the first time, and they cry on each other's neck, or necks in the case of Binyamin, which represented the loss of the Mishkan in Shiloh, which was Yosef's neck, and the loss of the two Batei Mikdashos, which were in Binyamin's territory. I will tell you just as an aside, because I wanted to dedicate this class in the memory of my grandfather, my Zaydi, Tzvi Noach ben Moshe, whose yortzeit is the Shabbos, his Neshama Shav and Aliyah. So he was just, he was a very simple man, but whenever somebody would come to his door, like a shliach or something, or a salesman, and say to him, are you the head of the household? He would say, yes, I am the head of the household, and my wife is the neck. And wherever the neck turns, the head goes. And that's what he was famous for always saying. So we know the neck is a very, very important component of the body. But we did ask previously why the neck represents the Beis HaMikdash and the Mishkan. Right? That's not just, okay, it sounded good. We need to actually understand why. So, and I'll tell you something. When I first put this thought together originally, which is a little bit ago, I wasn't sure I was going to say the message at the time, and then I got sometimes God is very subtle with the signs you get, and sometimes he blasts them. Still, we can't always hear it, but nonetheless, he's blasting them sometimes. So I wasn't sure, and then something happened literally the day I was writing it, or whatever. It had happened very shortly before that made me realize it was validated. But we'll talk about that in a second. So the Shem Shmuel, who is the Sachat Shavar, I am very, very fond of the Shem Shmuel. They are a very cool dynasty. It's the Kutzker Rebbe, Rav Mendel of Kutz, the great Kutzker. His son, he married the Avnei Nezer marries the son, who the Avnei Nezer is very famous in his own right. He marries the daughter of the Kutzker, and they have the Shem Shmuel. So you have the Kutzker, the Avnei Nezer, the Shem Shmuel, the Chotam Mashulash. I mean, that is a very powerful lineup. So the Shem Shmuel talks about this idea, and he discusses why the neck specifically represents the Beis HaMikdash, and he says the following. On that Rashi, he says, we will begin with the meeting of Yosef and Binyamin. Rashi obviously comments on the strange plural form necks, but it is far from clear why the Beis HaMikdash is referred to as a neck. This usage actually follows the verses in Shir Hashirim. There are two different verses in Shir Hashirim that refer to the Beis HaMikdash as a neck. One is called the Tower of Ivory. Your neck is like a tower of ivory. The other one is the neck, the neck is the tower that David built. So that's just adding on. Those are two references to the fact that, again, we call the Beis HaMikdash a neck, but it doesn't answer the question. So he says, my Holy Father, which is the Avnei Nezer, explained that there is a distinct similarity between the physiological function of the neck and the purpose of the Beis HaMikdash. The neck is quite simply the link between the head and the body, between the physical and the intellectual, spiritual component of a person. That is the link between the two. This is exactly the purpose of the Beis HaMikdash. It is a link. It links God and his spirituality to the physical world, a conduit of spiritual flux through which two unlike realms can meet. So we see the neck represents the Beis HaMikdash because it's a connector between the spiritual, the intellectual, and the physical. So based on that, we can suggest the following. Have you ever noticed the unusual nature of terrorism today? I know that's a kind of weird question, like there's a usual nature and an unusual nature, but it used to be, when we were growing up, right, and even more recently, it was bombs hijacking planes, right, and then there was the suicide bombs. But then it seems to be that there's been an advancement or a regression, I'm not sure what you would call it, in the way it's done. Now, instead of using more sophisticated weaponry, what's being used? Axes and knives. And what are they doing? Where did ISIS first make its mark? Beheading, right? That's how it first makes it. We haven't seen beheading in I don't know how many centuries. All of a sudden, that's their big thing, the beheading. And what happened? In turn, they inspired other Arabs, the Palestinians, took to the stabbing, and the stabbing in the neck. Everything now, all of a sudden, with the beheadings. What seems like an antiquated and retro way to kill people is actually much deeper and symbolic than we, and perhaps even they, may realize. Why do they behead people? Why do they behead? So based on something I once heard from Rabbi Ilan Feldman, we can suggest the following idea. When you behead someone, when you cut them at the neck, what are you doing? You're separating the head from the body, which means you are separating the spiritual from the physical. And that is precisely what they are looking to do. Their ideal, in keeping in line with their ancestors, is that you cannot have the spiritual and the physical together. And we know that because they have that laughable ideal of 72 virgins or whatever it is, but only if they die Right? There's no such thing as in this world for them to have the spiritual and the physical together. The idea is, in the afterworld, there will be spiritual. Here, it's physical. That is exactly opposite of Judaism. Judaism is all about merging the ruchnius and the gashmius together as one, elevating the physical through the spiritual. That is what we believe. They cannot have the two together. And therefore, they and their cousins, the Palestinians, they started to take that cue, and now they started beheading people, stabbing Jews in the neck. Why the neck? Because the neck is that connector. It's the connector. It is what we stand for. The ability to have a synthesis between the physical and the spiritual, which is exactly opposite. And we see from the Shemi Shmuel and his father, the Avnei Nezer, that the neck represents not only the connector between the physical and the spiritual in a person, but it also represents our holy sanctuaries, right? And therein lies the key. It is specifically in those places, our shuls, our beis medrashes, that we have to redouble our efforts to act properly, to daven properly, not talk, focus on our service of Hashem, take it very seriously. Only then are our necks protected. And that could very well explain the curious incident when Yaakov meets Esav, another reunion with crying and necks. After so many years they meet, and the Torah says that Esav falls upon Yaakov's neck and kissed him, and they cry. And the Medrash tells us that actually Esav tries to bite him on his neck. There are actually dots over the word, Vayishakehu, in the Torah. It's a signal. We need to understand that, I know they say a kiss is just a kiss, but apparently it was not over here. Apparently it was more than a kiss. And what was it? Esav tries to bite Yaakov on his neck, which we can now also understand to mean he tries to behead him. He tries to sever Yaakov's neck. Why? Because that was the machlokas between the two of them. Esav did not, he was against the very idea that you could merge spirituality and physicality in the same thing. He believed he would get the physical, Yaakov should get the spiritual. He was upset when he sees Yaakov has all this wealth because Yaakov, it seems, has the spiritual and the physical. He's upset. He tries to sever his head, and ultimately, his neck rather, and ultimately what happens? Yaakov's neck turns to marble, the Medrash tells us, and Esav's teeth get blunted. As a matter of fact, they say that's why he was crying. He was not crying because he was sad or happy. He was crying because he just bit marble. But nonetheless, we see Esav was unable to harm Yaakov. And that is the message for us. If we want to protect our literal, actual necks, if we want to make them impervious to attack, then we must protect our necks, our shuls, our beis medrash, our sanctuaries, our holy places, by acting properly in them, treating them dignified way, not talking in them. That is the way we can protect. And they want to disconnect, I guess you spell it D-I-S-C-O-N-N-E-C-K-E-D, disconnect our necks, but we must protect our necks. And how do I know that this is a message that I believe the Shemi Shmuel and his father, the Avnei Nezer, would have approved? So they are buried in Poland, in Sachachau, and after I had written this down, I saw in the paper the following, that vandals had come to the graves of the Avnei Nezer and the Shemi Shmuel. They're both buried in the same place next to each other. They wrote Islamic State was here, Holocaust never happened. What's amazing about that is that it's Poland and they wrote in English and they wrote ISIS things. And I said to myself, I'm assuming that was a message for me, that this is the idea of ISIS, that's what we learned from the necks, that they were telling us our necks, our holy places, we must protect them. That's how we are able to defeat ISIS and all their cousins that spend their days plotting to kill us. And that is the only way we can do that. So as we sit in shul, let us remember that if we want to prevent a disconnect, then we must protect the neck. Good evening. Doesn't sound as good as Good Shabbos, that's what I usually say, but I don't think that would be appropriate.